Hey, it's Abby. So for my portion of the YouTube project, I'm going to be talking about the effects that non-chemical pollutants have on Native American water. And so I found two main types that I want to cover. The first one is the stagnation of water that happens a lot in Native American tribes in their water. And then the second one I want to look at is the mix-up and leakage of pipelines into the drinking water. When my group and I divided up the topics, I got the non-chemical pollution, and I hadn't talked about any kind of Native American water in my actual paper that I did earlier in the semester. So I had to do a whole bunch of different kinds of research. And the first problem that I found is that there's actually not a lot of research on non-chemical pollutants. It's mostly focused on things like uranium mining and major pipelines, which of course are two really important factors in their water. However, those two factors aren't it. So I found that this is like the first major problem. And so to get into the first issue, which is water stagnation, I found a story about a man named John Doyle, and he noticed a lot of dying and diseased fish in his tribe's water. And so he went out and he tested it, and he found that all of the water sources came back positive for E. coli bacteria, which, as we all know, is super harmful and it makes a lot of people sick. And he also found that there were large pools of stagnant water that kept coming up in the rivers. They weren't flowing well. And so those also came back positive for E. coli. And then the article went on to talk about how it took him around 40 years to raise enough money himself to clear up all the water. So of course this meant that so many people were still getting sick because it took him so long. And this is a direct effect of the lack of funding that Native American tribes get from the EPA. So the second main issue that I looked at was the mix-up of water pipelines in Native American lands. And so to kind of describe what this means, basically when the pipelines were put in a super long time ago, they're all really old, the pipelines that were responsible for waste and the pipelines responsible for water, they run really closely parallel to one another, which means that they leak into one another. And so there's not as much of a problem when the water pipelines leak into the sewage pipelines. However, as you can imagine, when the sewage leaks into the water, it becomes a huge issue and it creates a lot of sickness. And so once again, there's an issue with the cleanup of the pipelines because there's not enough funding from the EPA that goes into the Native American tribes. And if you look at other locations, places like Flint, Michigan, while they're not getting a huge amount of funding, they're still getting more than Native American tribes are. So to kind of wrap up, I wanted to talk about solutions and kind of looking towards the future. And I think that the biggest solution that would be able to help the most amount of people is just by being more aware. I mentioned earlier that there wasn't a lot of information about non-chemical pollutants. And I think that that is why there's still such a big issue with things like water stagnation and pipelines, is because people aren't very educated on the subject at all. And so the second, which is kind of a long shot, it's like a very broad solution, but obviously the EPA needs to start providing more funding for the Native American tribes, because without that sort of funding, there's no way for the cleanup to actually happen unless, in John Doyle's case, it took him 4 decades, which is such a long amount of time for something so pressing. So I also think that more media coverage on Native American water would actually really help for more people to become aware. I think that if we all knew the whole picture and we knew how serious the problem actually was, I think more steps would be taken to kind of improve the situation. And I think it wouldn't take as long for the water to be cleaned up. So that's kind of what I have for my video. So thank you so much for tuning in.